I'd love to invite you all to this evening's fireside conversation with Dr. Bonnie Bright. We'll be exploring the soul-centered approach to coaching using Jungian and depth psychologies. An exciting topic for me at very least. I'm sure those of you showing up for this evening's session, evening here, will be as excited as I am. So before we introduce our conversation partner this evening and get into the topic, I'd like to invite us all to take a collective breath, to ease into our bodies, to drop ourselves into the space in which we find our bodies situated today, and to find ourselves in a circle, a metaphorical circle, which we'll imagine together. So let's begin by inviting a few inspirations through the nose and allowing long, slow exhalations out from the mouth. Breathing in through the nose, releasing that breath slow and steady from the mouth. And if it feels natural to let your eyes be closed, you can do so. Continuing in the cyclical breathing pattern. And following the sensations of each in and out breath. And with the breath, feeling into the sensation of your body as a whole. Tuning your awareness into the entire volume of space that your whole body occupies. Maintaining awareness of the breath and your body as a whole. And you can adjust yourself now to be perfectly comfortable, although I recommend an upright back. And how about we imagine, even those of us watching this recording later on, that we can come together now in a circle around a campfire. And I'd like you to imagine this campfire around which we come into a circle formation. And surrounding us, an ancient forest of wise old trees, protecting us, nurturing us. And you can imagine now taking your position by the fire, forming this circle. Familiar faces and new ones too. Hand in hand, perhaps. Imagine this setting in whichever way feels natural and comfortable for you. With the warmth and the light of the fire reaching each of us. Flames extending into the sky. And look around the fire. See that glow in the faces of all those that are here in circle with you today. And you may keep your eyes closed if you like. That would be fine. Or you may allow them to be opened. As I read for us the biography of Bonnie Bright, who will share her knowledge and wisdom with us today. Bonnie Bright, PhD, is the founder and director of the Institute for Soul-Centered Psychology and Coaching. She is a certified archetypal pattern analyst and a certified transpersonal soul-centered coach. She holds MA degrees in psychology from Sonoma University and in-depth psychology from Pacifica Graduate Institute, where she also completed her doctorate degree. She uses archetypal and shamanic perspectives to help clients navigate spiritual awakening, to integrate breathwork, meditative, psychedelic, and other non-ordinary experiences, and to move through creative blockages and open their lives to joy and transcendence. Dr. Bright is accredited through the International Association of Coaches, Therapists, and Mentors. She has trained extensively in dream work, in holotropic breath work, and in the Enneagram, a psycho-spiritual personality map for transformation. Bonnie has also completed a 2-year training in Indigenous African spiritual technologies with initiated West African elder Malidome Some, and has worked with Indigenous shamans and healers in Africa and in North and South America. Bonnie created and served as the executive editor of Depth Insights scholarly journal for 6 years and is the founder and director emerita of Depth Psychology Alliance, an online organization with over 5,500 members. She has conducted over 100 audio and video interview podcasts on depth psychology and is the editor of Earth Climate Dreams, Dialogues with Depth Psychologists in the Age of Anthropocene, 2019, and Depth Psychology in the Digital Age, 2016, among others. Bonnie's path to soul began with a spontaneous mystical experience in 2006, and she continues her quest for awakening each day with a sense of joy, freedom, and gratitude at the magic afoot in the world. She continues to live into her gift and calling by helping others to find their path to soul and to learn to do the same for others. Bonnie, what a pleasure it is to have you with us this evening. Hello and welcome.
Well, hello. Maybe I should say aloha, which is the tradition here where I live. I'm just so delighted to be with you today, Jevon. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm so looking forward to having some conversation with all of you at some point during this session.
Well, it's been a long time in the making, Bonnie. Just to add, you completed the transpersonal coaching training that we offered too some years ago. You and I have been in sporadic communication since then. But I've so looked forward to diving deeper into this particular topic, which is your specialist area for ages.
Mm-hmm.
And so,
rich. Yeah, it's very exciting.
I've got a few questions here that I'd love to ask to get our conversation started. And then there are quite a large group of people here in the room with us, and questions are welcome from anyone at any time. And if you do have a question, you're invited to put your hand up and to verbalize your question. We'd love to see and hear from you rather than chat, but if putting a text chat message in the chat window is your preferred option, then that's fine too. So just to get our conversation started, Bonnie, you are certified as a transpersonal coach, and you practice a form of coaching which you refer to as soul-centered coaching. So how would you describe what it is and why you adopt this term for your work?
Yeah, that's a great question. And of course, probably many people have different connotations around the word soul. So it might be helpful just to start there and to suggest that while many people who have had religious upbringing might associate soul more with religion, I really think of it as that part of ourselves or our lives that helps us to make meaning in life. And it's actually not really ironic that we use the word soul in any kind of the psychologies, because if you go back to the root of the word, actually psyche means soul in Greek, and that is where it was adopted from early on. So technically, I guess you could say most of the Psychologies would actually be considered soul-centered psychologies on some level, because that is technically the name. But I really would want to maybe establish here that Carl Jung, who was the Swiss psychiatrist, he was born in 1875, just to give you some idea of kind of when he lived and what his lifespan was. He died in 1960. But he really was, he was a scientist, he was a medical doctor, he was a psychiatrist, as we mentioned. But when he began to get interested in the work of psychology, he was really mentoring with Sigmund Freud. And he and Freud did a lot of work together on what they were calling at the time the unconscious. And they're not the only ones doing that, by the way. There were several other individuals at the time who were working with the unconscious in different ways. But Jung and Freud ended up parting ways at one point in time, because Jung believed in the personal unconscious, which means all of the stuff that we have basically repressed or suppressed over the course of our lives. And Jung, through his own experimentation, his own experiences, he began to posit this idea of something that he called the collective unconscious. I'm sure most of you have heard about that, especially in the program that you're in or have been in. And that really means that there is a part of the world, a part of existence, a part of other things that we can't possibly know or identify that are in existence and that can actually give us some guidance wherever we go in our lives. So how we get to that is an entirely different story. So by the way, I just want to say, anybody that has questions as you go, I know I heard Jevon say that, but please, I really welcome them. So just as you go along, feel free to jump in at any point.
That would be great. So Bonnie, thank you for that introduction. So that leads me to wonder then, what is the role of the unconscious in soul-centered coaching? Because, you know, in psychology and in the applied domains of counseling and psychotherapy, the unconscious plays a significant role. But when it comes to coaching, what's the role of the unconscious?
Yeah, so, well, it's the same, I guess we could say it's the same as the role for everybody, not just in coaching, but the difference here is that we want to, as soul-centered coaches, get into contact, I guess, with the unconscious, to help our clients to begin to identify what is in their unconscious that actually has been driving their behaviors, or sometimes limiting behaviors for most of their lives. Most of you are probably familiar with, in psychology, what we call coping mechanisms. And of course, those coping mechanisms are traits or behaviors that we developed a long time ago, often in early childhood, to be able to deal with whatever was coming at us in the world. So, you know, there's different schools of thought on this, but a lot of psychologists believe that every one of us has experienced trauma of some kind. And so when we look at our behaviors to date, sometimes we can look at something that has developed in us as the result of us being faced with something that we didn't know what to do with when we were a certain age. And that's really kind of the definition of trauma if you're looking at developmental trauma. So in soul-centered coaching, we don't go into trauma so much, but what we do understand from that perspective is that we do have these unconscious defense mechanisms, coping mechanisms, behaviors that are showing up in the lives of our clients. And if there's a way that we can begin to understand what our own unconscious is holding, then we can begin to get into some of those behaviors and to really help our clients to be able to understand why they are the way that they are, why they're suffering. And then I guess just to come back to that, Jevon, to bring the soul back into that, is to really help them to understand how that struggle that they are going through, or perhaps an addiction, or perhaps a behavior that they really don't like or isn't serving them, perhaps a belief of some kind that they just keep getting trapped in all the time. All of those are related to the way that we can make meaning in our lives. And so coming back to Jung for just a moment, he recently, I guess about a decade ago, a book was published by him, by his family, really, and that was the Red Book. And the Red Book is basically a set of journals of the experiences that Jung was going through during a very dark period in his life. It was in the 19-teens, somewhere around 1914, 1915. And he was actually working on these kinds of experiments with himself for several years. And those experiments consisted of him dropping into an expanded state of awareness and then noticing what symbols and images were coming through for him, and then engaging with those symbols and images, because from his perspective of the collective unconscious, he really believed that these symbols and images were representing some aspect of our existence that we needed to know about. So from his perspective, he said the soul speaks in images. And therefore, it is really important that we look at the images that show up in our lives, especially those that have some kind of emotional or latent kind of pull for us, or something that really has energy around them for us. If we can look at those, we can actually begin to see them as a bridge to the unconscious, a bridge to the soul. He used unconscious and soul quite interchangeably. And that word soul really came out of the work that he did for those many years, which was eventually published in the Red Book. And he really talks about the dialogues that he had with these different symbols, different characters. So the study of the unconscious, I will just say, is probably most of you have heard about this already, but really it is in-depth psychology, which is kind of interchangeable with Jungian psychology. There are some differences, and we can talk about that if anybody's interested, but really basically to say that it is the study of dreams and mythology and fairy tales and art and religion and nature, because all of these things come into a very multidisciplinary science that Jung was trying to build, but they also, on the other side of the coin, carry that latent meaning for us that we can really get into. If we begin to excavate the symbols in a certain way, then we can actually begin to find their meaning for us personally. And then the doors and the portals start to open to what that actually means in our lives. So not only can we identify past, past situations, I guess, or behaviors that are currently causing us challenges, we can also identify resources that can be really helpful to help us move through some of the challenges that we're having. So it's a very, very rich field. And you can tell from those different arenas I mentioned that, that really the world is our oyster. There are so many different symbols that come up. And so when I work with clients in a soul-centered manner, it is usually around eliciting some kind of a symbol or some kind of a somatic response, or some kind of a shamanic technique for those of you who are interested in or have some exposure to shamanism. So those are really some of the ways that we begin to work with that.
Well, Bonnie, that really opens the playing field for coaches, because it just gives us so much to consider and to utilize in the coaching relationship. And still, I guess, those of us that aren't trained extensively in psychology, but more so in coaching practice, might want to be a little bit careful in terms of what we facilitate, what we enable the client to open up to or access, because I guess some symbols may point toward trauma, some may point toward resources. And coaches need to learn how to navigate that territory and hold space in an effective way for clients. So I wonder what advice or things to look out for you might want to point out at this stage that coaches need to know about when they're helping clients to access the unconscious. And along those lines, what would be appropriate means for coaches to help clients access the unconscious inside of a coaching session, for example?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, these are great questions. So I guess I can begin by expanding a little bit on those three. Maybe you weren't counting, or maybe not everybody recognized that, but there are actually three what I call pillars of soul-centered coaching. The first one that I mentioned is somatic. So hang on to that, because we're going to come back to that in just a moment. The second one is symbolic, which we talked about just briefly, just a few moments ago. And then the third one is that shamanic. And that really talks about some different kinds of techniques that we can use to begin with. So coming back into the first one, the somatic, what we understand and believe is that, our body holds memories of pretty much everything that has ever happened to us, but it also gives us access to not only memories, but also sometimes those expanded states of awareness that we're looking for. So it is very important. Thank you so much for pointing that out, Jevon, that we really pay attention. We have to be so present in the coaching process when we're working with any of these three arenas to make sure that what is coming up for the client is something that they can hold and feel safe about holding to. So it's really important that we pay attention to how someone is responding to things. When we go into working with one of these arenas, let's say the somatic, often what I will do personally is to allow them to drop into, again, that expanded state of awareness at some point during the conversation, not unlike actually what Jevon, you did with us earlier. And but in this case with the somatic, to really allow them to, or invite them to do a body scan and to see where in their body they are feeling something that seems to be wanting some kind of attention. And this is a really powerful technique. It's based in part on the practice of focusing, if any of you are familiar with that. It's also focused a bit on the practice of somatic experiencing. And there are some other kinds of somatic processes and practices that have really been developed to get at what is that unconscious information that we are holding in our bodies that might be helpful for us to understand. But part of that, then, when you do that body scan and you ask a client to identify some place in their body where they are feeling something that seems to want some attention, then what we will do is we will start to focus in on that. And really, for me, what that's about is helping them begin to figure out where and to differentiate where they are actually identified with any of the behaviors or the challenges that they are going through. So what I mean by that is when somebody appears in a coaching session and they're challenged with, they're late to everything all the time, for example, what I understand about that as a general rule is that that is a behavior that they don't like about themselves, and they might have shown up in order to try to change that behavior, but there's so much a part of them that is identified with it, meaning they believe that's who they are. They feel that that is a behavior that has been, developed somehow by them, and they don't have any control over it. They don't know how to stop it. And by the way, because a lot of the root of that behavior is buried in the unconscious, they don't have any idea that there's even kind of a lever or a vehicle that we can use to really be able to start separating out what is that behavior and what's behind that behavior, and how is that represented in your psyche? How does it represent when you show up with somebody? So what I might do then is, when I drop them into a somatic practice and ask them to identify, where in your body does it feel like there's something that is available to you or wanting to make itself available to you? The idea is that that is in response to whatever it is that they're working on. So we're not going to draw a causal effect, cause and effect. They come in wanting to work on being late all the time, and then dropping into a somatic where they're not looking for something literal. They're not looking to find out where in their body it makes them late. What they're looking for is what is in their unconscious that we can then help them to sort of separate out so that they can see it, and they can see something about that behavior, so that now it becomes two. They're no longer so identified with it that they can't see things about it, and it's just driving them unconsciously. In fact, they can see something about that they didn't know before. So that process looks like, just to be maybe more specific, that process looks like asking them, does that place, wherever you've identified, let's say it's their right shoulder, does that place have a texture to it? Does it feel like anything that you can tell me that I can identify, so that I can understand what it is that you're talking about? And I'll ask them, does it have a color? Does it have a temperature? And once they come up with that, they might say, oh, it feels like this gray metal plate in my right shoulder. And so we'll continue to work with that and sit with it, again, with the understanding that what we're trying to do is just to separate out something that they were not aware of before. What is that something? Well, it's a pain in their right shoulder that feels like a hard gray metal plate. Well, what does that mean? You can see how this is starting to unpack something that we didn't know before, but we don't know what it means. So the meaning then comes from continued interaction with that object. And eventually the idea really is to be able to be in a relationship with that thing, whatever that was. And once you can see that you're in a relationship with that thing, because it's two things, it's you and then that thing, then you get to start to decide, do I want to be in relationship with it the same way I've been in relationship with it, that thing that's making me late all the time? Or do I want to, move over here and actually befriend it? Because that's often a big part of the work that we do is to learn how to accept all of those things about ourselves that we really, have been told or was told to us when we were very young, and we don't even remember that they were not acceptable, that our parents didn't like it or appreciate it, or society didn't, or our peers didn't, or our teachers didn't. And so what does a little kid do? They just have to repress or suppress all of those things down inside. And then those make our behaviors what they are. So, we don't know what that being late is about specifically, but when we can separate it out and identify something about that and give it some traits, almost personify it in some ways, then we can begin to have maybe at that point a dialogue with it. Before I go to the dialogue, I will just say I often have them do something that is more manual, not just jumping right into a dialogue, but actually to do something to engage initially. And that might be, sometimes I'll tell them, look for the edges of this thing. Can you see where that gray metal plate in your shoulder is actually moving into the flesh around it? What are the edges like? What happens if you were to just in your mind's eye, just stroke the side of that gray metal plate? How does it feel? How does it feel to you? Does it react in some way? Does it pull away, or does it just sit there? Does it feel like it wants to engage in some way? Then we can move into that dialogue, which is something around, what are you for? It's always a great question to ask something that we're working with that is a symbol, because that's where we're going with all this. I think you can probably see the trajectory here. When we work with that symbol, we want to begin to engage in order to find out what knowledge it already has. Now, I want to say something going back to what you said, Jevon, earlier about just being cautious around this kind of work with clients. If we encounter resistance of any kind in that process, the general idea is always to respect whatever boundaries are already in place, because sometimes that resistance is covering or surrounding some kind of a trauma in that client's life that as coaches we really don't want to get into. We need to be sure that we are really taking care of the client and doing no harm. That's such an incredible mandate that we want to be cautious about stirring up things that may then be problematic for the client to deal with. So this is all meant to really find resources, to find ways that people can see things from different perspectives. Before, they were so identified with that thing, they couldn't see it. But once they get into that dialogue, they might actually learn something from this thing that was formerly unconscious, which is now becoming conscious in the form of a symbol. And then they can engage and they can elicit whatever information is there for them. And by the way, that is a practice that Jung referred to as active imagination. If you haven't heard of this, go look it up. It's amazing. It's a wonderful practice. It's not that Jung is the only one that engaged with this practice, but he certainly was one of the forefathers who made this kind of a practice a common practice in psychology and coaching, things that will allow us to engage in this kind of personal way, I guess I should say.
Yeah, Bonnie, thank you for that in-depth insight there. And in some ways, we think about and refer to the same phenomenon just in slightly different ways. You spoke about a thing very loosely so that we can bring our own meaning to that. We would call it a part. So a part of the psyche is emerging. It's symbolic or metaphoric in some way. You use the plate in the shoulder. And then what in somatic practices is often referred to as blending, attending to the symbol or metaphor in whichever way it represents itself, the way that part shows up. And then kind of the attitude is one of leaning in with curiosity. That's the way I understand what you've shared, and maybe terms I might have used, I think, in an attempt to describe what I understand to be the same phenomenon, leaning in with curiosity so that we can learn what does that part have to reveal? And then you spoke of something else might emerge, a resistance, which we might identify as another part, a protector part in internal family systems terminology, a protector part that's there to protect this other part, which in turn is protecting from the memory of the trauma, which perhaps is a bit too difficult to confront directly. So how does parts work in this way relate to, or is it all the same, just different words to describe what you were describing?
Well, you know, I think that we never really covered yet the idea of archetypes. So maybe we can start there. It's a really great question. Jung is the one who actually coined that term archetypes. I'm sure most of you have heard of that by now. Archetypes basically are described as patterns of behavior. But these are not just any pattern of behavior. These are patterns of behavior that are recognized across all cultures and across all eras. So for example, if I said the word to you, teacher, every one of you will have some version in your mind or in your understanding of what that means, teacher. I don't have to define it for you, right? And I could go to any one of a different number of different cultures and use that word in whatever language, and people would understand it the same way. Or I could go back 5,000 years ago and people would understand that word the same way. So this idea of archetypal patterns, these are ways that information is shaped. And so we can have like the archetype of the teacher. Everybody understands that that's sharing wisdom and maybe sharing it in a certain way, wisdom, knowledge, experience. But there's also this idea that we have individual teachers. So an individual teacher may not look exactly like the archetype. If we take the archetype of mother, that's maybe even an easier way to understand it. My mother is not the same as your mother, Jevon, but at the same time, they both are based on this archetypal idea of what a mother is. It's kind of an archetypal energy, let's say. So Jung said that archetypes are the building blocks of the psyche, meaning, or you could transfer that to the building blocks of the unconscious, meaning often what we're looking for when we do work with somatic or with symbolic, we are looking for the archetypal pattern that is at work in that moment. So sometimes you might uncover an archetypal pattern of a victim with a client when you're working with them. Sometimes you might uncover an archetype of the hero, of the savior. I always joke about this, but somebody that's important in my life we always joke that they have a real savior complex. And there's any number of things in that person's life as we started to look at that actually sort of support that idea. And the behavior that is not wanted in that particular situation is really not to just jump at every opportunity to go try and save somebody else, but rather to make sure that you're letting other people have their own opportunities for growth and not trying to take away their struggle, because we learn through struggle, right? And then the other piece of it is to make sure that that person is putting enough of their time and energy onto themselves. And so there's a lot that can go into any particular archetype. The idea always, Jevon, and for everybody, is really to understand that every client has all of their own answers. As a coach, we are not coming in and telling them anything, and certainly not diagnosing or telling them what to do, but we are instead enabling them or empowering them to find ways to tap into their own unconscious, otherwise known as the soul, right? And the understanding that that soul actually has the blueprint for us, has an understanding from the big picture level of what's happening in our lives, what we're going through, what are the archetypal patterns and challenges that we're doing in this lifetime in order to be able to grow, to learn and to grow. And so once we can identify those archetypes, it just opens up so much around that to be able to really understand ourselves in the way that we are looking to. I forgot if there was more to your question, Jevon. Is there anything that I didn't answer in there that you still want to follow up on?
You expanded on my question. I was initially inquiring about parts, and we moved into archetypes, right, which is sort of a grander theme or part that encompasses smaller parts, doesn't it?
Exactly. Yeah. So thank you for that, because of course we might say that our unconscious, collective or otherwise, or collective or personal, I should say, because there's really only the two types. Our unconscious is made up of those archetypes, but we might be carrying any number of archetypes. how many archetypes are there out there? Who knows? It could be thousands, it could be millions. It's basically anything that we can identify as that pattern that is common. And within one of us, our unconscious carries any number of archetypes. So you identified one just a moment ago, Jevon, when you said the archetype of the protector or the defender. There's a part in all of us that is part of the ego, really, but the ego is part of our psyche. It's part of the ego that has learned that we must be protected, or felt in some situation that we must be protected. And then that archetype kind of appears as the defender, because that is the role that it's playing. But when a client shows up in front of us, we might also identify that they have other different archetypes that are at work. And so it can be really helpful from that parts perspective to understand and identify what archetype are you coming from in that moment, or what archetype, maybe better said, is having its way with you in that moment. Because again, this is all unconscious, and the unconscious is what drives our patterns. Once we can make these ideas conscious, then again, it gives us more choices, more options to decide how we want to be in relationship with whatever that archetype is in our lives. And maybe it's just fine the way it is. You might uncover some archetypes that just feel really pleasant and good. But a lot of times the good archetypes, quote unquote, I guess we would never say some are good and some are bad. It's just the way that we look at them from a human psychological perspective. We tend to put labels on them, but every archetype has its role, even the defender, to your point, Jevon. So that defender might send us into some really difficult behaviors like addiction or alcoholism. But what is that defender trying to do? It's trying to help keep us safe from maybe some overwhelming feelings that we had at an earlier time in our life. And we just realize, or that archetypal defender realized, that we have to be able to numb ourselves, for example, so that we don't feel it so strongly, or we need an escape mechanism. And so we take on this pattern or habit of every time there's conflict, we will leave the room or escape and go do something that can take our mind off of it. So this is where actually I will also bring in the idea of the Enneagram, which I think kind of correlates also with that idea of parts. And that is that for those of you who aren't familiar with the Enneagram, Jevon mentioned it in my bio. I've been working with this for almost 25 years. It's such a powerful, it's billed as a personality typology model, but from my perspective, I know it to be so much more soulful, let's say. And that is that it really provides a map of us to be able to understand what are the coping mechanisms that we developed as a child. Because our Enneagram typology, there are 9 different types, and then it's as a system. So there's a lot of different information that can be put together in those different configurations. But most people default to one of those core kind of archetypal patterns that are listed or show up in the Enneagram. And then we can begin to understand again, what is your way of coping, or what is your client's way of coping that they developed because it was the best of all paths to be able to take when they were a kid. Maybe escaping didn't work when there was conflict. Maybe their parents forced them to stay in the room if there was a problem and they were not allowed to leave, so they couldn't escape literally or physically. So maybe they came up with some other different kind of a defense mechanism or a pattern. So I look at the Enneagram to understand what core typology do you default to, because that doesn't put you in a box. It actually shows you, if you want to put it that way, the box that you're already in. If you can identify what is at work in your psyche at that given moment, then you can begin to understand what is its role, why is it making me suffering, if it is, what, or how can it provide me more of those resources and those opportunities for growth that I can get. And again, it's like knowledge is everything, right? As we begin to make what is unconscious conscious, that's where the choices and the opportunities come in for transformation and growth.
Oh, this is rich, Bonnie. Thank you. Knowledge is everything. Perhaps I might add that perspective goes a long way too. And I think in at least some part, what you're speaking to is the value of a transpersonal perspective, of having that wide lens and the skill set, the transpersonal skill set, that is, to support clients in recognizing the box that they're living their life within. And through having that perspective, gain the knowledge, that enables them to have the freedom to choose to leave that box if they so wish. And then the role of the coach to support them in their own personalized means of, if I can extend this metaphor any further, leaving the box and living without it or living beyond it. Okay, I don't mean to be bringing my own metaphors in here. I'm wondering if anybody else in the room, because there are a lot of experienced coaches among us and psychologists and many people with backgrounds that relate to the topic that's been discussed. So I'd really love to welcome questions from others at this stage. Otherwise, we'll just let Bonnie keep on telling us and sharing what she has to share, which I certainly would be thrilled by.
Well, Bonnie, there is one question from the chat window. Rafat, I hope I say that correctly, would like to know regarding defender and protector, if you're using archetype interchangeably with complexes.
Yeah, so that's a great question. Thank you for that. Technically, in Jungian psychology, every archetype is at the core of a complex. So a complex, for those of you who are not as familiar with that word, it is this idea that it's kind of a pocket of energy where our wires got sort of tangled up and crossed. So that means that maybe when we were younger or at some point in our life, something happened that we didn't know what to deal with. And so we have a lot of structure that's built around that particular wound or difficult situation. And we are trying to protect it in that case, but usually at the core of that is some kind of an archetypal idea that is behind that. So wounding itself, which is a word that is kind of commonly used in depth psychology as well as other kinds of psychologies, is actually archetypal in and of itself. If you think about it, it is an archetypal idea to have a wound. And so I wouldn't say it's always interchangeable, but I would say it's definitely very closely linked in that way. Do you want to ask more than that? Do you have additional questions on that?
Thank you, Bonnie. You know, it's quite clear. I have to say, I'm really enjoying your talk. I love Jung, but the question that first came to my mind is, where is the boundary or the line drawn between your methodology and classic Jungian analysis?
So where you're saying between Jungian methodology and classic Jungian analysis, is that what you said?
Sorry, between your methodology, as in coaching, that's
got it.
Theory, and classic Jungian analysis.
Well, that's a great question. My degrees are in depth psychology, which are primarily Jungian, with kind of that broader reach into other things like nature and culture and science and things like that. But technically, there are a lot of techniques that Jungian analysis uses that we can tap into as long as we are continuing to look at it with our coach's hat and continuing to understand that there is a line there between, you know, getting into people's trauma and addictions in a big way, and as opposed to bringing in resources for them, for helping them to have insights and understandings of where they might be able to look for continued learning and understanding of what their situation is. And again, what we're really doing in this is, as with most coaching, we're really empowering the clients to have vehicles and tools and ways to be able to connect with that unconscious, with the soul, because the understanding is really that the soul is our GPS and that it is talking to us all the time. It sounds like you know that because of your work with Jung. So, you know, if we look out into nature and we see something happen, a bird flies away, or we see a certain animal, or we see a tree that is diseased, and, you know, we can always look at that and say, if it's caught my eye, maybe there's something interesting, it has some kind of energy for me. And then how can I look at that as a metaphor for what's going on in my own life? So a lot of this kind of coaching is, first of all, educational, which is really training and teaching people about the power of the unconscious. And then secondly, about the power of symbolic work. Jung really talked about living what he called a symbolic life. And I just love that idea, because that means that basically everywhere he went all the time, he was constantly looking for the ways in which the soul was talking to him. And so he could be walking down a street and see a scene on the side of the road, or he could be in nature and watching, the wind blowing ripples on the lake, or he could be having a dream at nighttime and waking up with this scenario that he had absolutely no understanding of when he first woke up. But by the time he started applying his principles and ideas of symbolism to that dream of metaphor and symbolism, then suddenly the meaning began to emerge. So it's those kinds of techniques of helping people to understand how the soul is talking to them all the time that are really so valuable in this process of what I'm calling soul-centered coaching. It's not the term that I came up with, but I don't see very many people using it. And I really adopted it early on because I also love transpersonal psychology. My coaching certificate, as Jevon said, is in transpersonal coaching psychology. I've known Stan Grof for quite some time. He was one of the first people that I met when I had that spiritual emergency that Jevon alluded to in my biography. And I really appreciate transpersonal psychology because it does give us access to those things that are not part of our normal everyday understanding, right? And it scientifically validates also the value of that. And so I just am so appreciative of the perspective, to use your word, Jevon, that transpersonal psychology brings to us too, because it gives us really the freedom to be able to walk in those, in those worlds, in the invisible world, and to interact and engage with it and know that we are not crazy. And of course, that is another caution though, is to always be very careful, because Jung advocated that we do not do what he called active imagination, this engaging with those symbols from the unconscious, if somebody is not really mentally stable or well, because it could, if somebody is tending towards psychosis, for example, and again, these are psychological words that you guys don't really need to know or understand, except in the case of, what to stay away from or when to refer people to somebody else. But the idea is really that when we go into these unconscious realms, it is very, very, very powerful. Jung called the unconscious, or the collective unconscious, the objective psyche. And he called it that because he believed and he taught that it has its own intelligence. That, yes, one way to look at it is these characters in our dreams, for example, or this deity that showed up in a movie over there, or in a myth that we read somewhere. Yes, they are aspects of our own personality. So it is the parts system. It is the archetypes that are at work in me. If I have a relationship with Pele, for example, which I do, she's the goddess of fire and volcano here in Hawaii where I live, then I can understand that that is an unconscious aspect of myself. And so I can engage in dialogue or engage in some kind of relationship with Pele, for example, where I can sit with her in meditation and see what she has to talk to me about, or I can ask her for advice, or I can read her stories and see what some of the symbols are in her stories and get information about what I need to know right now in my own life. So part of that is an aspect of understanding that it is part of us, part of an unconscious part of us. And then part of it is an understanding that these parts are autonomous when they're unconscious, because if we don't have that conscious relationship with them, they are really running our lives. And by the way, we can also look out into culture and see how some of these archetypal ideas are really devastating in our culture and causing a lot of difficulties. I'll just say, since I'm on a riff already about that one thing Jung said is we don't worship the old gods anymore in our culture. And of course, he died in 1960, so I can't imagine what he would be thinking now. But he said we, instead of worshiping the old gods who stood for, truth and various different traits that we could point to, he said we now worship the goddess reason, with a capital R, meaning we have come to such logical and specific kinds of linear thinking that we really tend to dismiss the imaginal world, the unconscious world, the symbolic life that Jung advocated. And it's really, really important from the perspective of soul-centered coaching that we help people to reconnect with that aspect of their lives that most of us have become completely disconnected from, because society didn't value the imaginal world, because we were taught that, you can't have telepathy or you can't know things from out of the blue. But the truth is all of us are wired that way. We know that our brains have so much capacity that we don't tap into on a daily basis. And so you can start to see how there is a lot of information out there if we are willing to look at it and see it we're willing to work with our dreams, if we're willing to sit with and work with something that really grabs our attention and in our symbols, that can be very powerful. And so I'll just say, and I'm sorry, I saw another hand here. So I'll just say to close on that particular idea, I wrote my first master's thesis on the idea of colony collapse disorder, which is the mass vanishing of the honeybees. Some of you have heard of that. It really first started coming to public light in 2006. And at that time, I heard it on the radio. I heard a report that was saying beekeepers were taking the top off of their beehives and finding that the hives were completely abandoned, with the exception of the queen, who is the lifeblood of the hive. She lays somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 eggs a day in order to continue to repopulate the hive as the older bees die and disappear. And also the honey was still in those hives untouched. Now, normally, the honey is what feeds them. And so they would definitely be eating that if they were starving. It was just such an incredible mystery to scientists. And so I took that on because it was a symbol that just had this enormous energetic, I guess you could say, impact on me. At the time that I remember exactly where I was and what I was doing when I heard that radio report about that. And I remember just being like so focused on it or thinking about it so much in the following days, because when I was a kid, my dad had bees. I grew up on a farm. There were bees out in the field. And so I really, I was very curious about it. And so you mentioned that earlier, Jevon. Curiosity is such an incredible tool. I have to say, a lot of people in our culture are not really still ready to jump into the imaginal because they've been told that it didn't have value in our lives, or that it was frivolous or something like that. But if we can actually help them to understand that when things hold energy for them, that there is a message there, and that the way that we can imagine into a given situation is what can open those doors for us, it becomes something very different. So I finished my master's thesis by doing research on that, a Jungian or symbolic look at what colony collapse disorder means. And of course, I got into honeybees and symbolism in mythology. I did lots of shamanic journeying around it. I did lots of active imagination to really begin to engage and to elicit what was the symbolic information that was there for me. And by the way, all of these symbols they belong to whomever is having the symbol. Like, I can't interpret one of your symbols. I could give you some ideas. I could tell you what I've heard about it. You can go look at different things to do what Jung called amplification. And amplification is really just basically looking at what is the information out there in society or in culture or in science that we can look at and draw metaphor from. What are the patterns that we can look at and say, oh, honeybees do this, and oh, wait, there's where that shows up in my life. And so it's super cool when you really get into these kinds of traits and these kinds of ideas symbolically, the whole world just really opens up to you. It's just so rich and so powerful.
Bonnie, thank you for that wonderful example with the bees and their meaning to you. And it's very evident that there's still a big impact of your encounter, that original initial one, and the effect of that with you today still. And I think it's a wonderful, vivid reminder to all of us to look for what gives us meaning, and to have the intention to seek meaning and a practice that enables us to be receptive to that. And I think that's an important consideration for transpersonal coaches as well. Intentionality and a practice to foster this potentiality that exists within us. But I'm going to move over to Tui, who's got a question. You've been waiting a long time, Tui. Let's hear from you.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Bonnie, for sharing your experience. It's been really wonderful to hear your vast array of knowledge and insight. And my question is maybe simple, maybe not, but I know you've used the term soul and unconscious interchangeably. And I would just love to hear more of your thoughts around that, because for me, what comes up is there is a distinction for me and what it feels in my body of soul and the unconscious. And so I just would love to hear the exploration around that more for you. Just to open my definition of that a little more.
Yeah, happy to do that. I wonder if you'd be willing to share a little bit about what your the way that you are seeing it at this perspective. And then that way, maybe I can build on that.
Yeah, totally unscientific. I think for me, the soul is sort of a higher place of our calling, like when we quiet everything within us and we tap into what is sort of aligns us to that higher source of spirit or connection to our God, right? And it's sort of this place in which guides our life, whether we know it or not. And then the unconscious seems to be more about behaviors or things that have been buried away or that are still like uncovered and not in our awareness yet. And so are not necessarily sort of moving our path forward. They're just there as maybe sort of just inquiries into opening up our awareness. So it seems to me like the unconscious and uncovering that helps us move towards what is within our soul. But the soul seems much broader to me, and it seems much of a higher calling than just the unconscious. So I just would love to hear, how that gets defined for you.
Yeah, that is such a great question. I really appreciate that, because this is a very gray area for a lot of people, right? And it can be really helpful to begin to understand what those two are, because really the way, I'm sure most of you know, the way that we learn anything is through the felt sense of something, right? And we can learn things here and have it in our minds and be able to recite it back to people, but we really don't learn something until we feel it in our own body or feel it for ourselves. So one suggestion around that is to really do the best you can to find those kinds of experiences that feel soulful for you. But I will just take that question and go backward in time to start with, and to say that William James, who is a name you might have heard if you have studied psychology at all, he really is considered the forefather of psychology by many psychologists. He was born around mid 18th century, mid 1800s, I should say, sorry. And he eventually wrote a book that was called The Varieties of Religious Experience. He was very interested in religion and what that impact that had on us as a culture and what it had on us as individuals. And what he recognized in that is that there is some kind of an inner instinct in humans that causes us to reach for that something. You called it something higher, Tui, but I would maybe prefer, for my own purposes, to say something bigger than us, because higher on some level indicates to me that it's up here somewhere and we have to like get up there or reach up there to get it. When in fact, for me, the idea of soul is that we are our soul self. We are soul. We are in soul. In fact, Nietzsche, I think it was, said first, the philosopher Nietzsche said, I don't know if the soul is in me or if I am in the soul. And so by that, he was indicating all things in my life, all of what I can see outside my windows right now, which is nature, wild nature, all of the experiences that I have had. But I think a really good differentiator for our purposes here is to say that soul is, well, maybe the best way to look at it is that from Jung's perspective, which was highly spiritual, and one of the reasons that sometimes you might go through a psychological program and not get a lot of Jung is because, as I mentioned, he tried as hard as he could to make depth psychology science. But the truth is he was having so many of these experiences on the side that were very deeply spiritual that of course, that was what his work was about. And he then tried to bring the science into it. And he really did a good job. I think he did the best that he could. But the truth is most of this just cannot be documented or verified. It has to come through that felt experience or the processes by which he was using those. So what he was suggesting is that soul is, this is not his words, but the way that maybe I can look at it is soul is a blueprint for us. I think I said that earlier. It is the idea that there is a big picture, that perhaps if you move into a more spiritual perspective, and if you are feeling comfortable doing that with your clients, this idea that maybe if we have consciousness now in our lives, maybe we also had consciousness before we were born into these bodies. So this gets into, some of the metaphysical stuff, but Jung was really a huge believer. This is what the transpersonal is all about, right? It's beyond the personal. So it's reaching out into these other domains like mythology, like maybe even past lives, like mythological characters and archetypes, things like that, to really understand that what Jung was talking about was, when he mentioned soul, was the collective unconscious. It's the same kind of idea as the transpersonal realm. So instead of looking at it as soul being something higher or even something bigger that is only moving us forward in our lives, actually the study of soul from a depth psychological perspective is that everything in our lives happens because our soul or our consciousness had some kind of a plan for us, so that we can learn and grow here in our lifetime while we go through our own challenges. So that means that everything from his perspective is soul. Even those imprints, as opposed to the blueprint, if the imprint is something that we received as a child that is causing us to move into certain behaviors, the only answer to that then is the blueprint, to go to the blueprint and locate where you are on the blueprint and to see what information is there. It's like a map for our lives that says, okay, right now you're struggling. Right now you're having a dark night of the soul, as Thomas More and many others have put it in history. A depression. Jung was a huge student of alchemy. He did it for over 30 years because he felt it was the perfect metaphor for our human journey here on Earth. And that is to go through these processes where we are challenged and where pressure and heat can actually help us to grow into the diamond being that we already are. His whole emphasis was on wholeness. And so it's collecting those lost parts of ourselves and putting them back together consciously so that we can understand who we really are outside of those behaviors and those beliefs that we developed from a young age. So Jung would say that everything is soul. Jung would say that when we are in a dark night of the soul, that it's absolutely part of the plan, that everything that comes to us is some kind of a communication from our soul self, from our GPS that says you need to be going this way, you need to be going that way. If you're struggling, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going the wrong direction, but what it means, at least from my perspective, and this is something I work with clients all the time, is that you are going through an initiation. Everything is an initiation. And if we can just look at it from that archetypal perspective and understand that it is something that is going to, that has been given to us, let's say, for our greatest growth, then all we have to do is to work with that and be with it and not reject it and not try to get away from it or escape it, but rather to welcome it, to embrace it, to lift the lid on it and see what is actually beneath that depression or beneath that challenge that you're facing in your life, because there's something there for you to learn. And if you can only be with it and sit with it and hold it for long enough to let it tell you what is here for you, then you will be able to move through whatever that challenge is and move on. But with the gifts that you have received from confronting that challenge, from spending time with it, from being with it, not from ignoring it or dismissing it or repressing it, as we probably had to do when we were little kids. Now that we're adults and we have access to all these tools and resources and consciousness, we have the capacity to be able to actually revisit it now and to be with it in a new and different way. And then we can process through it and integrate what that experience is for us. And then we get to be able to have those gifts and to move on. And by the way, when you do this for yourself as your own inner work, guess what? You can pass that on to your clients because you have an understanding of how you got through it. And at least then you can kind of provide a sort of roadmap for comparison for them to say, oh, wow, I see that you did this, and maybe I can try that too and see if that will work for me because it resonates with me. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, that fully makes sense in terms of integration of our experience and delving into more than just like the symptoms of what has happened in our life. And so I guess what I'm hearing is that like the unconscious is the soul, is part of the soul. Mm-hmm. Sorry, your picture was moving around. So
yeah, I'm sorry. I realize I'm
so
it
is part of the soul anyways. And I guess it was just when we use them interchangeably in that way, yeah, it feels like the unconscious opens up to the soul.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a great way to put it. Exactly. Everything is inclusive in soul. And that means soul is giving us what we need all the time if we are able and willing to look at it from that perspective, that the unconscious is also part of the soul, just as you said, that is unconscious for a reason, and that there is so much to mine there for us to excavate from not only our own personal biographical past experiences, but also all of those transpersonal experiences and stories and patterns that are out there.
Great. Okay. Thank you so much.
Jevon, before we continue, I just noticed, I'm sorry, but I noticed my computer's not charging. I'm just going to hop around the other side and make sure it's plugged in tightly. So I can hear you if you'd like to continue, and I'll just come right back, or if you'd like to pause, either way is fine with me.
Come right back. There's some hands up ready for more questions. But my understanding of what Bonnie's been sharing is that by lifting the lid on these unconscious aspects of the self and leaning in, I might add, with curiosity, holding that compassionate space for oneself and the experience that unfolds, we become more soul enlivened. We live a more soulful life. I'm going to have that as my take home at this stage in any case.
Beautiful. And don't forget, soul is what makes meaning. So by choosing to have a more soulful life, you're also choosing to step into that meaning and to live into what is here for each of us in our calling and our work in the world.
And what beautiful work it is. Josiane, please ask your question.
Prepare yourself for something complicated now. Listen, you say, go with me with my mind, okay? So you said the soul is the same, the unconscious. And you said you make a parallel between with the shamanism. You said in the beginning, but you didn't wrap up. But I read the article, so I know what you mean. So I know what you mean. But then let's pretend I lost a little fragment of my soul, okay, in a trauma or something that can be so many ways, right? So I lost it, and like the shaman goes there to get the part of my soul and bring me back to me. Beautiful. Where he's going? So he's going to the unconscious, the collective unconscious, because you're saying to me that soul is the same that unconscious. So if it's the same as me, so how I lose something that's me? I can lose something is in me and is myself. So I wonder where he goes for this part, and the shaman or you in your therapy to get this part back, because there is something is missing here, because if it's there, if it's you, how you lose it? Right. Unless this lost part is in the collective unconscious, then I understand, because it can have kind of a big store of all our stuff, and you go there and grab and bring it back. Okay, I don't know if it makes sense, but yeah, if you can help me out. Yeah.
Makes sense to me. Thank you. Great. So let me just reiterate a little bit, or just summarize a little bit about what maybe Josiane is referring to, and that is the idea of soul loss and soul recovery, which are very shamanic ideas, archetypal ideas, we might say. The idea is that when things happen to us that are too much for our little psyches to bear, especially in childhood, but it could be in adulthood if, a sudden accident or something that is profoundly overwhelming in the moment that we just don't know how to deal with it or what to do with it. Those are the opportunities that we would say in shamanism to lose a part of our soul. And in shamanism, often it is said that that part of our soul or our whole soul is taken off to the underworld. It's abducted, or it can get lost, to your point. So those two things are probably, we don't really need to define between those two things what can happen. In psychology, a similar way to look at that would be what we call splitting. And splitting is the idea that when something that is overwhelming happens to us and we don't know what to do with it, a part of our psyche actually kind of splits itself off, separates itself out, and starts to build those defenses around it because it doesn't know what else to do. And when it builds those defenses around it, actually what happens is it kind of stunts its growth, right? It freezes it off, almost as if like when an oyster has a little piece of sand in it and it starts to make that pearl around that grain of sand. That's kind of the way that we can look at it. That's also a one way to look at complexes too, right? It's these parts of ourselves that we didn't know what to do with that become split off from us. Yes, they still exist. Yes, they are in the collective unconscious. Yes, they're even mostly in our personal unconscious. But what has happened is we have lost contact with those, because either they have become so numbed or so repressed that they're out of our sight or out of our understanding, or we had to disconnect meaning or even memory from them because it was just too much for us to bear at whatever given moment. So I would say that, where does the shaman go? Well, shamanism, as most of you know, is the oldest spiritual system on the planet. It's not considered a religion, but it is definitely an organized system. And by the way, shamanism looks almost exactly the same on every single continent across history. And by the way, they didn't have internet back then, as you know. And so it's not like they were collaborating on what that process was of healing people or providing insights. But all shamans, to my knowledge, they do travel into other worlds, other dimensions, other places to access that, either that part of the soul that has been lost. But from a psychological standpoint, from a soul-centered perspective, we might say that that is meaning that has been lost in our lives, that if we are willing to go into that and re-look at it and let it come to the surface and work with it and help ourselves to feel safe with it and to use the tools and resources that we have, then we can begin to reincorporate that into our lives in a way that we can live with it and deal with it. And it doesn't have to be repressed and cut off from us anymore. So, there is two ways of looking at, I think, what is the same thing, the same archetypal idea. Is there more on that particular question, Josiane?
Yeah, it's a little complicated because in my soul retrieval, even he has to ask the part, do you want to come back or not? Because sometimes the part doesn't want to come back.
Right.
So it's kind of terminology, I guess. I think because I'm perfectionist, sometimes I get stuck. So I think it's kind of a terminology, right? It can be like dormant, like you said in the, what's that word that you use? In the splitting. It's splitting. In the splitting, it's just sleeping is with you and you can wake up and bring it back. In the case of the shaman, it's not split, it's away far in another dimension. And maybe it's more complicated, so we need to bring back. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and
by the way, I want to tell you that the archetypes, it's a concept that for me, I struggle with it, but the way you taught it, very nice. It's kind of, it's straightforward. Thank you for that.
Great. Yeah, thank you. I appreciate the feedback.
You have a good didactic way to post things.
Thank you. Enneagram, for those of you who know it, I'm a head-centered type, so that didactic, it comes pretty naturally to me, and it's the felt sense that took me a little longer to get into. So I do just want to say one final thing on that. The way that you described it was just so beautiful about the differences between shamanism and soul loss, but maybe I'll just bring back here to kind of close on that particular portion of the conversation, just by reminding you of what Nietzsche said about, is the soul in me, or am I in the soul? If I am in the soul, then it makes sense that a shaman would have to go somewhere else to get that part of the soul that has been lost and to bring it back. And the second thing I will just say also is, again, that respect for what doesn't want to come back. We always want to honor that because there's a reason for it, and we don't want to force anybody to do anything that might open that wound back up again and be something that they can't handle. So it's really, really, really important that we pay attention to when things don't want to comply and not to force them in any way, shape, or form. Does anybody else have questions? I see a few in the text over here. What shall we do?
I'm doing the transpersonal coaching course right now, and I'm just curious, seeing that you've got experience with both, how you would really see the difference between soul-centered coaching that you do and the transpersonal approach. Mm-hmm. And then the second question is a little bit about, you're talking about soul, and we also talk about source in what I understand so far from the transpersonal approach. And I'm just curious how Jung saw the relationship with God, and also how you speak about that with clients. Because it's such abstract, and we all have our personal experiences and maybe things that we've heard about from, you know, whatever our backgrounds might be. But I'm just curious, like, our relationship with God and purpose and such, and free will, how that plays in, and if our soul is our GPS and there is a right or wrong direction, or it's all lessons, like, what is it all about? You know, I'm just kind of curious. I know that's a big topic, but I'm just curious how you see it, if you were able to kind of distill it, and how you speak about that to clients.
Yeah, thank you. It's great. Well, you know, it's kind of interesting. Language is such an incredible vehicle, and yet it can also be problematic for us, especially when we talk to clients, because I have to discern each time somebody comes to me as a client where they are in their spiritual process and what terms they are comfortable with. If somebody was raised really religiously and moved away from it as soon as they could because it was problematic for them, they may have a real aversion to the word God, for example. There may be some nuance there that just is triggering for them. At the same time, most people that come to me, at least, maybe because of what I have entitled the coaching, do have some understanding or some belief in some kind of a bigger something. And one of my favorite quotes from Jung says, you know, the most important question for mankind, humankind, is, are we related to something infinite or not? And the way I read that is, are we related to something infinite or not? In other words, what is our relationship with that thing that is infinite? Whether you call it God, whether you call it soul, whether you call it the collective unconscious, whether you call it the great spirit, you know, there's a number of names for it. I tend to approach it quite generally, because that way people can kind of fill in the blank with whatever term they are the most comfortable with. But the way that I present it is that, yes, there is something bigger than us. Yes, it has all the answers that we need. Yes, there are ways to access that. And yes, there's a big part of that also that comes in, and that is that trust that there is something bigger, even if we haven't had enough of the experiences that we need in order to really be able to live with that kind of knowledge and trust and understanding on a day-to-day basis. So I usually like to start with the idea of an image or a story about the ego and the soul self, as I like to call it. And that is that the ego is driving a limousine, and it's a dark and stormy night, and it's driving around, and it has no map and no GPS and doesn't know what to do. And it comes to a junction, and it doesn't know which direction to go from that junction. All the while not realizing that in the back seat is somebody who has a GPS and knows exactly where you're supposed to be going. But the problem is that window, that divider window in a limousine, was up the whole time. And so we didn't have any idea. So I like that image because it tells us that there is something bigger with us all the time. And if you want to take it deeper than that, it is us. It's just that, we just have access to such a tiny, tiny little portion of understanding of what is. And so I usually like to approach it from that perspective that I believe, and I would never ask other people to believe what I believe. It's only if it's resonant for them, but I offer to them that what I believe is that we were that consciousness before we came here to Earth. And if that is the case, and this is again, very personal for me, so I'm not asking you guys to buy it, but because it is what I'm calling soul-centered psychology, I think it fits well with that. And people that show up to work with me are kind of, prefaced to be able to take that in. So what I tell them is what I think is that if we were consciousness before we came, then it may have been a decision for us to come and to be embodied in physical form so that we could have access to all the experiences that we can get as humans through our senses, eating, seeing, tasting, touching, smelling, all of those things that pure consciousness probably can't do. Also to have human relationships, which are hands down the thing that make us grow, the most in our lives, whether it was as a young child or whether in current relationships. So if we understand it from that perspective, then I like to suggest that maybe if we chose to come here and to work on certain things in order to learn and to grow, maybe we kind of picked the archetypal themes that we wanted to work on, almost like when you go to college and you pick a major at the university, you can kind of choose the classes that you want to take. And so maybe we choose the experiences we have. You don't have to believe this literally, but you can also look at it symbolically if you would like to. We can look at it from the perspective of the hero's journey, which is very classic. Joseph Campbell made that available to everybody, the mythologist Joseph Campbell. And that is the idea that we leave what is known, we go out into the unknown, we can get lost in the dark forest, we can meet the demons and the monsters. And then ultimately we have to either battle or trick or use our wits or something to go past those obstacles or those gatekeepers, because those difficult experiences are actually guarding the treasure that is in the underworld. That's the classic hero's journey story, right? Once the hero can get that treasure, which is the understanding and insight of what that difficult experience gave us, then that character returns to the community with the gifts that they have been given. So this is all kind of in the context of we are related to that something infinite. We did come here for a reason. We have a purpose and a calling. The difficult experiences that we're having are to get us into the place where we can overcome those difficult things and step into our gifts and our understanding and our knowledge. The more we can heal ourselves and understand about ourselves, the more we can express our true selves. We're not caught up in trying to please other people or trying to fit into some kind of a mold or trying to do things because we feel like we should do them or because we're compelled to do them for some reason. And once we begin to understand that, then we can be called forward on that path by soul. All we have to do is listen and understand when it's difficult. Okay, what is it I'm supposed to be learning here? And I have gone through so many times in my own life when something just wouldn't break. I just was in it. And I knew that the moment that I figured out what it was that I was supposed to be learning from that, it would give. And sure enough, it always does. Sometimes it's a matter of years. So, it's a matter of being in the process and not trying to skip over it, but being in it and really letting yourself be present with what is here in this moment. That is listening to what the soul has for you so that you can find out more of who you really are, and then you can step into your gifts and your calling. So I was in my 40s before I ever figured out what I wanted to do when I grew up. And that was this, but I had no idea, and it didn't come to me until very late. That was a source of extreme distress for me for the longest time. But once I found this, I recognized that this is absolutely what I meant to do, what I'm here to do. And by the way, all of the experiences I've ever had in my entire life, not to mention the transpersonal stuff, have been leading me to exactly this point so that I can sit here with you guys today and share something of what I've learned and be able to take in some of what you've learned and, be in community. And it's not like 1 + 1 = 2. It's like all of us here together actually can be part of and can influence a much, much, much larger segment of the population because we're aligned, because we're in resonance with that. So I'll just finish that question by coming back to your first question, and that is, what's the difference between soul-centered psychology and transpersonal psychology? Well, there's not much from my perspective. I like to say that soul-centered psychology is a combination of depth psychology, which is what Jung termed his psychology originally, Jungian psychology, which is what most people in the United States at least call it. In Europe, it's a little more known as analytical psychology, but it's also a combination of archetypal psychology. There's a Jungian by the name of James Hillman, who died just a few years ago, who did a lot of work on archetypes and archetypal psychology. And then, of course, it's a combination of transpersonal psychology too, because transpersonal psychology in a way gives us the permission to really explore these realms from a scientific perspective. Personally, I kind of think depth psychology is the same thing as transpersonal psychology. I'm not sure what those guys were thinking when they came up with a new name for it. And I'll just be very, verbal about that and kind of joking. But really, truthfully, what's beneath all of these is, I think, that access to that something bigger that allows us to be able to understand more of who we are and to overcome our shortcomings, and then just to be able to open up into more creativity, more authenticity, more joy, more freedom.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Bonnie, this has been rich and stimulating on so many levels. And I think the amount of energy and enthusiasm and that optimistic note that you've just brought us to is a beautiful place to bring our time together to a close, but not to an end. As you've said, coming together as a community and, considering that we're in circle around a fire, we can keep this fire burning through the ways in which we intend to live our life, the meaning we give our experiences, and through enlivening our collective soul.
Beautiful. Thank you so much.
Let's make that a call to action for those who are willing to take a piece of that. That's how I'm going to be responding to this beautiful message, this whole stream of messages you've shared with us this evening, Bonnie. And when this video goes live, there'll be a description below it, including a link to your website. So anybody who wants to find out more about your beautiful work will be able to access that.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much for your presence, for being here.
Go well. Until next time. Bye for now.